Hi, Stephen Hand from Staccato in Hobart. A little while ago there was a really productive discussion on the HEMA Alliance Facebook group about how to interpret historical fencing treatises, and I put a fairly long post up there that a lot of people liked, and so I thought it would be useful to discuss how I go about interpreting historical fencing treatises in a little more detail. The first thing that I do whenever I look at a new treatise is I annotate it. That is, I go through it line by line, paragraph by paragraph, page by page, and there really is no easy, quick way to do this. And I write out in my own words what I think the master is telling us to do. Then I go through that annotation, and what I do with the annotation is I turn it into drills. Right? If the master's saying you should do this, I write it down as person A does this, person B responds like that, and I turn it into a drill. Then I will, once I've got a sequence of drills, I'll get a senior student and I'll work with that senior student. I'll usually find somebody who's interested in learning a new system, and we'll work through those annotated drills that I've come up with. Now, sometimes they work really well and I think, okay, yep, that interpretation was very good, and I'll stick with it. On other occasions, it's clear that the way I read it off the page isn't going to work in practice, and so we rejig it on the fly. So, all right, well, how else could we interpret this passage? And my senior student and I will work up a new version. And we go through this until we're reasonably happy with the overall interpretation we've got, and then I'll start teaching it to a larger class. Once I've been teaching something to a class for a while, other problems start to arise. Once we start particularly to bout the system, there's some things which work in drills, match the text, but they start to break down under pressure. They're a good interpretation, but they're almost certainly not right, because under the pressure of real bouting, they break down. Something isn't right about them. Another thing that we can find is that systems are all about principles. Now, in most cases, the old masters, and it's not the case when we're starting to look at 18th, 19th, 20th century treatises, because they write differently, but in the early treatises they tended to put down exemplars of what you should be doing. They didn't say, here are the principles, this is how you put them into practice the way the modern mind works. They said, here's something you could do, and you've really got to sift through that to work out what the principles underlying those exemplary techniques are. And that can be quite difficult. Once you work out what the principles are, sometimes you'll come to the conclusion that, hang on, this technique appears to match what's in the treatise. It appears to work, it seems to work, but it actually runs counter to one of the principles that we've been using in the treatise. And quite often I'll find that if I just do a bit of a rejig of that technique to bring it into line with the principle, that it actually works quite a bit better. One example where this happened, there's a passage that first examination seems to be really obvious and only open to one possible interpretation, and that's in George Silver's Brief Instructions upon My Paradoxes of Defence. And that passage is actually made up of two passages. In Brief Instructions chapter 2, Silver's been talking about lying low in variable fight, which means with your hand low and your point towards the opponent. And he says at point 10, when you shall ward, blow and thrust, made at your right or left part with any kind of weapon, remember to draw your hind foot a little circularly from that part to which the same shall be made, whereby you shall make your defence the more perfect, and shall stand the more apt to strike or thrust from that. And at chapter 4, paragraph 27, we're told, always remembering if you fight upon the variable fight that you ward upon forehand ward, that is, with the hilt low and the point up. So, it would seem to be fairly simple. If somebody cuts to my inside, right, and if I'm lying on staccato, that I will move my hind foot circularly to the right in what would be called a half incantata or a demivolt. And in fact, in the Mathy version of Brief Instructions, the first transcription that was made back in 1898, there is a footnote saying that that's a demivolt. And that's what I believed. I thought, yeah, okay, that looks right. And for quite a number of years I did it that way. Now, after doing it that way, it was good, but it was never perfect. One of the problems with this interpretation is that the hand moves quite a distance, and it's quite easy to deceive that parry. And this can be done with just a simple flow around the parry, or it can be done with what later masters in the 18th and 19th centuries would have called a whirl, and I'll show you those here. Now, Silver is very good at laying down his principles, perhaps better than any of the early masters. But one thing that became clear to me that Silver didn't state was that you should never cross your heels. And obviously if you do a demivolt, you are going to cross your heels. There's no other point in the manual where he crosses his heels. So I looked at it and thought, well, how else could you do what he says in the passage and still be effective? And I came up with another solution, which was to step with both feet, and it worked so much better. It was so much more mechanically efficient than what I'd been doing. Didn't cross the heels, and I'm just so glad I came up with that interpretation. When we change an interpretation, we fix one problem, sometimes many problems, but sometimes we introduce new problems, and this is the case with this technique. In the old version of the technique, I only move the rear foot. In the new version, I move the front foot and the rear foot. And so this enables you to make a pretty bad error. When you're doing this technique, you should never come closer to your opponent. And Silver talks about this in a passage. He says, if you bear this attack with forehand ward, be sure to ward his blow or keep your distance, otherwise he shall deceive you with every false. And what we have found is that when you make this parry, you're actually at the edge of distance. When you're trying to make your riposte, you actually want to be closer, and so a lot of people will unwittingly close distance as they make the parry, and it ends up creating a better parry. However, there's a fatal flaw. Silver says you must keep your distance, or someone can use a false against you. And what you do if you close distance, you may get a better parry if you make the parry, but your opponent, if he sees you closing distance, can change his attack ever so slightly and cut underneath your hilt. And Silver at another point says that one of the problems with forehand ward is that essentially your hilt can only go down so low, and that you can't cover your legs. So your legs need to be out of distance, right? And I'll show you how that works here. So looking at this technique, there's a fair bit going on. The initial interpretation definitely fit the text, and it seemed to work, but there were a few problems. It was a little easy to deceive, and as I went on and discovered more about Silver, I realised that one of his principles that he doesn't spell out, but which is nevertheless common to all these movements, is that he doesn't cross the heels, and this was the only time I was crossing the heels. The replacement technique is a lot better. It gets you to a better position, it gets your point on line, it's biomechanically more efficient, your hand moves a shorter distance in making the parry, so it's a lot harder to deceive the parry. But it has another problem. However, Silver discusses that problem, which suggests that the interpretation is correct, because that problem didn't really exist with the old interpretation, but it does with the new. Silver's aware of it. He tells you how to avoid it. Don't step into distance as you make the parry. So, when you want to look at a treatise, write down what you think the master is saying. Try it out with somebody. Try it out with a partner or a student. When you're happy with it, with what you've got, try it in front of a class, bout with those people, and you will endlessly, I mean, I've been doing Silver for a quarter of a century, and every so often we still make a minor modification. We're pretty happy with most of what we've got, but every so often there's a tiny little modification of, this will work just a little bit better. At this stage it's really tinkering around the edges, but it never ends. Short of necromancy, we're not going to get Silver to tell us exactly how it worked, so we just do our best. So that's the system that I use and have used to great effect in interpreting manuals, and hopefully if you use that, it will work for you. Thanks for watching.